Chapter 6. Operation Congresses. We must make ourselves heard round the world in a great campaign of truth. This task is not separate and distinct from other elements of our foreign policy. President Harry Truman, 1950. Despite the recalcitrance of some British delegates, Wisner was satisfied that the Berlin Conference had more than repaid his investment. Although its future was still uncertain, it was now added to the CIA's propaganda assets inventory, an official list documenting the ever-growing number of conduits and individuals on which the agency could rely. Known unofficially as Wisner's Wurlitzer, the nickname reveals the agency's perception of how these assets were expected to perform. At the push of a button, Wisner could play any tune he wished to hear. Wisner returned to the problem of Melvin Lasky, whose peacock presence throughout the Berlin Conference had so infuriated him. His earlier command to have Lasky removed from center stage having been so blatantly ignored, he wrote an angry internal memo, Berlin Congress for Cultural Freedom, Activities of Melvin Lasky, stating that Lasky's visibility was a major blunder and was recognized as such by our best friends in the State Department. It betrays an unfortunate tendency, apparently more deep-rooted than I expected, to succumb to the temptation of convenience, doing things the easy way, and irrespective of security and other technical considerations of the utmost importance. One, Wisner was unequivocal. Unless the headstrong Lasky was removed from the Congress for Cultural Freedom, the CIA would not continue to support the organization. Wisner's memo was cabled to Germany. The OPC officer who received it exploded and cabled back a histrionic protest, but there was nothing to be done. Lasky had to go, and OPC contrived to have him removed from the project. There are two possible explanations for this. Either Lasky had some kind of relationship with OPC and was therefore a real security risk because he refused to lie low, or he was, as he always claimed, an independent operator, in which case his removal represented the first of many such strong-arm tactics on the part of CIA. The OPC officer charged with Lasky's removal was Michael Josselson, whose tendency to explode when provoked would cost him dear in the future. Lasky and Josselson had already developed the strong bond which observers later found to be unbreakable. The psychology of this relationship is hard to fathom. Lasky's influence on Josselson, who was in every way his superior, was unique. Josselson was sometimes vexed by Lasky's willful deafness, wrote one Congress insider. He was sometimes exasperated by Lasky's failure to imagine the consequences of his words and actions, but at the same time he looked on him with indulgent admiration, even wonderment. Through to some, Lasky's hold on Josselson had an Oedipal angle. Josselson adored Lasky as the son he never had. He always defended him, for Natasha Spender remembered. Lasky objected to this sobriquet, preferring to describe it as a brotherly relationship. Either way, Josselson soon realized that his theatrical defense of Lasky was bad strategy, so he agreed to Wisner's demand that Lasky be officially removed from the project. Unofficially, Lasky would remain Josselson's closest advisor for the entire life of the Congress, and other rewards would follow. With Lasky apparently out of the way, Wisner now moved to establish the Congress for Cultural Freedom as a permanent entity. Its continuance had been approved by an OPC Project Review Board in early 1950, and it was given the code name Q Opera Part 6. One of Wisner's first decisions was to move the base of operations for the Congress from Berlin to Paris. There were powerful symbolic reasons for leaving the outfit in Berlin, but it was deemed too much of a security risk, too vulnerable to infiltration by the other side. Wisner offered Josselson the job of running the Congress for the CIA under Lawrence de Neufville, who was to supervise it from the agency's French labor desk. Both men accepted, resigning their cover jobs with the American occupation government in Germany, but taking with them their code names Jonathan F. Saba, Josselson, and Jonathan Gearing, de Neufville. Next, Wisner anchored Irving Brown to the Congress by appointing him a key member of the steering committee, which had been formed shortly after the Berlin Conference. More helpful than all the Koestlers and Sillones put together, Brown was once described as a one-man OSS and a character out of an E. Phillips Oppenheim novel. He worked for J. Lovestone, a former Comintern delegate who now headed up the CIA's secret liaison with the American labor movement. Brown was extremely adroit in pursuing objectives by clandestine routes and had been shortlisted by George Kennan in 1948 as a candidate to head up OPC, the job that eventually fell to Frank Wisner. Point 7. I don't believe I ever saw Irving Brown with a nickel that didn't belong to CIA, remembered Tom Braden, who was soon to take over Q Copra. He would say it was from the labor unions. It was a good cover. Brown was the paymaster, but he enjoyed participation in the planning of operations. He was an intelligent guy with a wide acquaintanceship. 8 also appointed to the steering committee was James Burnham. A constant presence in policymaking and intelligence circles, Burnham was considered indispensable to the success of the Congress, a vital liaison between the intelligentsia and Wisner's office. Burnham was a consultant to OPC on virtually every subject of interest to our organization, wrote Howard Hunt, the QA dirty trickster, who later emerged as one of the Watergate plumbers. He had extensive contacts in Europe and, by virtue of his Trotskyite background, was something of an authority on domestic and foreign communist parties and front organizations. Not everybody was happy with Burnham's Trotskyite background, though. According to CIA executive Miles Copeland, there was initially some fuss about the Burnham flirtation with the extreme left. Wasn't he in a cell of some kind that included Sidney Hook, Irving Kristol, and Daniel Bell? But all was okay when someone remembered a remark to the effect that if Jim were a serious communist, he would have joined the party and not been a mere Trotskyist. Besides, as one who had been on the far left and swung to the far right, he had good company in the CIA's stable of on-call consultants. Describing Burnham as 100% capitalist and imperialist, a believer in mom, apple pie, baseball, the corner drugstore, and American-style democracy, Miles Copeland said that he had learned from him the following principle. The first task of any ruling group is to keep itself in power. 10-1 Cold Warrior referred to him as a very articulate expounder of the dirty tricks department. 11. In early 1953, Burnham would play a crucial part in the CIA's Operation Ajax, which unseated Dr. Mossadegh in Tehran and replaced him with the Shah. Wisner had decided that the plan was far too crude and needed a touch of Machiavelli, by which he meant a history lesson from Burnham. In his book, The Machiavellians, which became a manual for CIA strategists, Burnham used, in addition to Machiavelli, the ideas of major modernist European thinkers, Mosca, Pareto, Michels, Sorel, to challenge egalitarian political theory and show the persistence and inevitability of elite rule, even in an age of equality. An old acquaintance of Burnham's once said that the only time she ever saw him manifest any real intellectual enthusiasm was when he talked about Machiavelli. 12. Alongside Irving Brown, Josselson, de Neufville, and Lasky, undeterred by his earlier dismissal, Burnham worked at giving the Congress for Cultural Freedom a permanent footing. Meeting at the end of November 1950 in Brussels, the steering committee designed a functioning structure for the organization, working from a document drawn up by Lasky in July. Among those present were Ignazio Salone, Carlo Schmid, leader of the Socialists in the German parliament, the Jewish sociologist Eugene Kogon, Håkon Lie, head of the Norwegian Labour Party, Julian Ameri, British MP, Josef Chapsky, Polish writer and artist, David Rousset, Irving Brown, and Nicholas Nabokov. Essentially, the structure sketched out by Lasky was the one adopted. An international committee of 25 was nominated, as were 5 honorary chairmen. Guiding their activities was an executive committee of 5, executive director, editorial director, research director, Paris bureau director, Berlin bureau director, who in turn would be kept in check by the general secretary. In Lasky's diagram, this structure looked like a mirror image of a common form apparat. They had names just like the Communist Party, observed one historian. The CIA set up these cultural foundations as shadow organizations of the Communist Party, including secrecy being at the core of it. They were really speaking to each other. 13. Nicholas Nabokov once jokingly referred to the Congress's ruling body as our Politburo boys. Also discussed at the November meeting was a report by Arthur Koestler entitled Immediate Tasks for the Transition Period. Here, Koestler outlined the technical tasks which needed to be accomplished as a follow-up to the Berlin Conference. Under the heading Political Campaign in the West, Koestler, who had been repeatedly snubbed by the neutralists at the Berlin Conference, wrote, "Our aim is to get those who still hesitate over to our side, to break the influence of the Joliot-Curies on the one hand, and of the cultural neutralists like Les Temps Modernes on the other." 14. Challenging the intellectual basis for neutralism was one of the principal objectives of American Cold War policy, and it was now assumed as an official line of the Congress. The CIA's Donald Jameson explained, "There was a particular concern about those who said, well, East is East and West is West, and to hell with both of you. We tried to move them at least a little bit over on the Western side of things." There were a lot of people who felt that neutrality was a position that was compromised. It was an attitude that one hoped would be diminished. But on the other hand, I think there was a general recognition that you didn't want to jump on somebody's neutral and say, "You're no good either. You're just like the commies," because that would push them off to the left. And that was certainly not desirable. But the neutrals were certainly a target. 15. Koestler, too, had become a target. His document was discussed by the steering committee in his absence. He wasn't even on the committee. Koestler's intolerance of disagreement, his irrational anger, and arrogant assertion of his own genius had now persuaded Washington that he was more of a liability than an asset. Since the June conference, Koestler had been holding regular meetings at his home at Verta Reeve with Burnham, Brown, Raymond Aaron, Lasky, and other members of the inner circle. He had, said Mamain, become quite obsessed with the Congress and barely able to sleep. These gatherings did not go unnoticed. In August 1950, the French communist weekly L'Action arrived at the imaginative conclusion that Koestler was planning terrorist militia from his home with Burnham and Brown. Josselson was now persuaded that a moderate tone was essential if the Congress for Cultural Freedom was going to achieve one of its principal tasks, the winning over of the waverers. The response from headquarters was to authorize the removal of Koestler from his central position in the organization. Thus, the man who had drawn up the Manifesto for Cultural Freedom was now eased out. Paragraph 3 of the manifesto stated, "Peace can be maintained only if each government submits to the control and inspection of its acts by the people whom it governs." 16. The CIA, by marginalizing Koestler and by its covert governance of what was to become the largest such agglomeration of intellectuals and freethinkers, was effectively acting in breach of the very Declaration of Rights it had paid for. To promote freedom of expression, the agency had first to buy it, then to restrict it. The market for ideas was not as free as it appeared. For Koestler, it was a devastating betrayal. He suffered some kind of nervous crack-up, flew to the States, and watched bitterly as the Congress for Cultural Freedom moved away from his ideas. Arthur Schlesinger was another valuable contact for the Congress. He was part of what Stuart Hampshire, Isaiah Berlin, and Stephen Spender nicknamed the apparat, the controlling group. Writing to congratulate Irving Brown after the Berlin meeting, Schlesinger noted enthusiastically, "I think we may have here an immensely powerful instrument of political and intellectual warfare." 17. Schlesinger knew something about such matters from his wartime work in the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, where he had been assigned to the Research and Analysis Department, which earned the nickname the Campus on account of its tweedy aura. Schlesinger had maintained close contact with the exclusive club of OSS veterans, many of whom, including himself, went on to become leading statesmen and presidential advisors. He knew Allen Dulles, who in 1950 invited him to sit on the executive. Committee of Radio Free Europe, which was set up that year by the CIA, its participation shielded from public view by its front organization, the National Committee for a Free Europe. Schlesinger had also been exposed to covert operations when he worked as an assistant to Averell Harriman, head of the Marshall Plan in Europe. There was a general feeling that the Soviet Union was spending a lot of money on organizing its intellectuals, and we had to do something to respond, 18 Schlesinger recalled. Under Harriman, he became involved in the secret distribution of counterpart funds to European trades unions, dealing often with Irving Brown. Schlesinger's relationship with Brown was now soldered by the mutual secret they shared. For Schlesinger was one of the handful of non-agency people who knew from the outset The True Origins of the Congress for Cultural Freedom. I knew because of my intelligence links that the original meeting of the Congress in Berlin was paid for by the CIA, Schlesinger later acknowledged. It seemed not unreasonable to help the people on our side. Of all the CIA's expenditures, the Congress for Cultural Freedom seemed its most worthwhile and successful. 19th. One of Schlesinger's first tasks was to persuade Bertrand Russell, one of the Congress's honorary patrons, not to resign. This the philosopher had threatened to do after reading Hugh Trevor Roper's mischievous reports in the Manchester Guardian, which had described events in Berlin as something uncomfortably close to a Nazi rally. Visiting Russell in London with Koestler on the 20th of September 1950, Schlesinger listened as Russell told of his alarm at Trevor, Roper's report, which A.J. Ayer had endorsed, and his subsequent decision to withdraw. Russell appeared cold towards Koestler. The philosopher had once made a pass at Mame Koestler, and a residual sexual jealousy between the two men continued to hamper their friendship, but finally accepted his and Schlesinger's arguments. Bertrand Russell, world-renowned mathematician and philosopher, was ubiquitous in 1950, the year which brought him the British Order of Merit and the Nobel Prize. He had met and disliked Lenin. His guffaw at the thought of those massacred made my blood run cold. My most vivid memories were of bigotry and Mongolian cruelty. Russell had startled admirers when, in 1948, in a speech in the bomb-damaged main hall of Westminster School, he suggested threatening Stalin with the atomic bomb 20. At this time, Russell was violently anti-communist and insisted that on our side, military strength and rearmament took precedence over all other matters. 21, Russell was also prized by IRD, from whom he was happy to receive little tidbits from time to time. But if Russell was a hawk, then, by the mid-1950s, he was urging nuclear disarmament. His aristocratic arse has sat on London paving stones along with queens and commies, wrote one poet. 22, his politics seemed to change with the wind, and he was to cause the Congress and its American backers much heartburn over the years of his patronage, until he finally resigned in 1956. But for now, his name added luster and satisfied what some detected was Jocelson's weakness for the talisman of celebrity. Like Russell, the other honorary presidents were all philosophers, and all representatives for the newborn Euro-American mind. Benedetto Croce was a political conservative and monarchist who had no time for socialism or for organized religion. His works were listed on the Vatican Index of Prohibited Books. Now in his 80s, he was revered in Italy as the eloquent father of anti-fascism, a man who had openly defied Mussolini's despotism and who had been adopted as the moral leader of the resistance. He had also been a valuable contact for William Donovan on the eve of the Allied landings in Italy. Croce died in 1952 and was replaced by Don Salvador de Madariaga, who was also closely linked to Donovan through the European movement. John Dewey, who had headed the Committee for the Defense of Leon Trotsky, represented pragmatic American liberalism. Karl Jaspers, the German existentialist, had been an unrelenting critic of the Third Reich. A Christian, he had once publicly challenged Jean-Paul Sartre to state whether or not he accepted the Ten Commandments. Jacques Maritain, a liberal Catholic humanist, was a French resistance hero. He was also a close friend of Nicholas Nabokov. Isaiah Berlin was approached to join this rosary of philosopher patrons, but refused on the grounds that such public support for an anti-communist movement would place his relatives in the East in danger. He did, however, promise to support the Congress in any modest way he could. It was Lawrence de Neufville's recollection that Berlin did so in the knowledge that the Congress was being secretly funded by the CIA. "He knew about our involvement," said de Neufville. "I don't know who told him, but I imagine it was one of his friends in Washington." 24. As with all professional organizations, the early days were marked by constant shufflings in the ranks as members jostled for jobs. Denis de Rougemont, who had never been a communist and was from neutral Switzerland, was made president of the executive committee. Author of L'amour et l'Occident, de Rougemont hailed from the non-Marxist, anti-fascist left. After the war, he had been a broadcaster for Voice of America and worked closely with François Bondy in the European Union of Federalists, whose aims he would continue to pursue with covert assistance from the CIA, of which, he later said, he was ignorant, from his Geneva-based Centre Européen de la Culture, which still exists today. For the job of General Secretary, Josselson lobbied hard for his preferred candidate, Nicholas Nabokov, who, even if he didn't know it, had auditioned for a leading role when he had declaimed at the Berlin Conference. Out of this Congress, we must build an organization for war. We must have a standing committee. We must see to it that it calls on all figures, all fighting organizations, and all methods of fighting, with a view to action. If we do not, we will sooner or later all be hanged. The hour has long struck 12. 25, Nabokov was duly elected to the post. Apart from his old friend Josselson, Nicholas Nabokov had powerful sponsors. There was Chip Bolin, that thoroughbred American who had made America a true home for Nabokov in the early 1940s, and who was to remain, said Nabokov, my model, my source of advice, often my comforter. And there was George Kennan, who had earlier been so embarrassed when Nabokov's application for government employment had failed. Nabokov's name also appeared on a top-secret list of psychological warfare personnel recommended for employment in sensitive posts and circulated to the office of the Secretary of the Army in 1950-26. This combination of powerful political patrons ensured that Nabokov's security clearance was not held up as it had been a few years earlier. Irving Brown, the paymaster, offered Nabokov $6,000. Nabokov, with 2 young sons to put through school, and currently receiving a salary of $8,000 for his teaching jobs at the Peabody Conservatory and Sarah Lawrence College, said he needed more. Don't forget that in this job, there will be representational expenses involved. I don't intend to give parties, but I will have to see many people, cajole them, invite them to meals, etc., etc. 27. Actually, Nabokov loved to give parties, and he would give many and lavish ones at the CIA's expense over the next 16 years. For the moment, however, the question of Nabokov's salary was unresolved. Irving Brown, who had access to a huge slush fund, had many other pokers in the fire. Whilst he was an energetic supporter of the Congress, his natural inclination was to spend the money available on funding the CIA-backed Force Ouvrière, in its attempts to break up the communist dockers' unions in Marseille, where Marshall Plan supplies and shipments of American arms were daily being blockaded. The matter was resolved when James Burnham stepped forward in January 1951 with a promise to boost Nabokov's salary. Other arrangements to compensate me for my considerable loss of income will be made here and will not appear on the books of the operation in Europe, 28, Nabokov told Brown, apparently untroubled by Burnham's flexible approach to accountancy. For the first year or so, Burnham virtually ran Nabokov. It was decided that Lasky would stay in Berlin editing Der Monat, whose office became the headquarters of the German affiliate of the Congress. Josselson and de Neufville would move to Paris and head up the main office there, liaising with Irving Brown, who was instructed to rent and equip a suitable property. As they were preparing to leave Germany, Josselson and de Neufville learned of an exciting new development back at CIA headquarters in Washington. Alan Dulles had just joined the agency, and he brought with him an assistant called Tom Braden. Things were going to change. Alan Dulles joined the CIA in December 1950 as Deputy Director of Operations. This was a position of immense scope, giving Dulles responsibility for collecting intelligence and for supervising Frank Wisner's division, the Office of Policy Coordination. One of his first acts was to recruit Tom Braden, one of his most dashing OSS officers, a man who had cultivated many high-level contacts since his return to civilian life. Wiry, sandy-haired, and with a craggy, handsome visage, Braden looked like a composite of John Wayne, Gary Cooper, and Frank Sinatra. Born in 1918 in Dubuque, Iowa, Braden's father was an insurance agent, and his mother wrote romantic novels. She taught him a love for the work of Ring Lardner, Robert Frost, and Ernest Hemingway. He graduated in political science from Dartmouth in 1940, then got so excited at the outbreak of war that he enlisted in the British Army. He was assigned to the 8th Army, 7th Armored Division, the famous Desert Rats, where he became best friends with Stuart Alsop. Both were to join OSS, parachuting into occupied France to fight in the woods with the communist-dominated resistance. After the war, Braden and Alsop co-authored a book, Sub Rosa, The OSS and American Espionage, in which they described OSS as providing its men with opportunities for the most amazing adventures recorded in any war since that of King Arthur. Returning to civilian life, Braden spent the next few years campaigning for a permanent intelligence service. In late 1950, Allen Dulles telephoned and asked him to be his assistant at CIA. Braden accepted. Assigned the codename Homer D. Hoskins, Braden was initially without portfolio, nominally assigned to Wisner's OPC, but in reality working directly to Dulles. Within a few months, he had gained an intimate knowledge of the communist propaganda offensive and a limited appreciation for the American response. How odd, I thought to myself as I watched these developments, that communists who are afraid to join anything but the Communist Party should gain mass allies through organizational war, while we Americans who join everything were sitting here tongue-tied. 29 William Colby, a future CIA director, reached the same conclusion. The communists made no secret of their belief in what they called the organizational weapon. Organize the party as the key command troop, but then organize all the other fronts, the women's groups, the cultural groups, the trade unions, the farmer groups, the cooperatives, a whole panoply of organizations, so that you could include as many of the people in the country as possible within those groups, and thereby under basically communist leadership and even discipline. 30. If the other side can use ideas that are camouflaged as being local rather than Soviet-supported or stimulated, then we ought to be able to use ideas camouflaged as local ideas. Braden reasoned, bought 31. An overview of Wisner's OPC convinced Braden that it was overburdened with projects which lacked a central focus. One CIA official described it as an operational junk heap. There was an international organizations branch, but it was a hodgepodge of little jobs the agency had around, and it was totally unimportant, Braden recalled. I went to A.L. Allen Dulles and said, "Why don't we merge these things into one division?" Maybe A.L. was hoping I would come up with something like this. 32. Whilst Dulles was enthusiastic, Braden's proposal was received with consternation by those CIA staffers who believed that covert operations meant organizing the overthrow of unfriendly foreign leaders like Jacobo Arbenz. If the infant agency was half faculty, it was already known as the campus, then it was also half cops and robbers. Alongside the pipe-smoking Yallies, there were the kind of people, said Braden, who hadn't understood that the war had ended. Dangerously headstrong, their thinking was of a kind with that of men like General MacArthur, who wanted to extend the Korean War by bombing Manchuria, or the Secretary of the Navy, who in 1950 had exhorted the world to prepare itself for another global conflagration. I was much more interested in the ideas which were under fire from the communists than I was in blowing up Guatemala, Braden explained. I was more an intellectual than a gung-ho guy. 33, Braden's division chief tried to block his proposal by arguing that it crossed division lines, a bureaucratic maneuver of monumental pettiness. A helluva fight ensued, which Braden lost. He went immediately to Dulles' office and resigned. Dulles, furious, snapped up the telephone and called Frank Wisner. "What the hell's going on?" he demanded. Allen was all over Wisner, Braden remembered. He took my side completely. And that's how I came to set up the International Organizations Division under the DDP Deputy Director of Plans, who was Wisner. But I didn't pay much attention to Wisner. I just went over his head straight to Allen. I had to handle it carefully because Frank was ostensibly my superior. The formation of this new division, abbreviated to IOD, coincided with, and its activities were sanctioned by, a new National Security Directive, NSC 68. Drafted in March 1950 by the new director of the policy planning staff, Paul Nitze, who had replaced Kennan, NSC 68 became the supreme documentary symbol of the Cold War and was based on the assumption of a communist monolith whose guiding spirit resided in the Kremlin, 35. The directive concluded that practical and ideological considerations both impel us to the conclusion that we have no choice but to demonstrate the superiority of the idea of freedom by its constructive application. Truth also needs propaganda, the philosopher Karl Jaspers had recently declared. Here was the mandate which authorized America's Cold Warriors to take constructive measures to ensure that the truth triumphed over deceit. The budgetary provisions set out by NSC 68 revealed the importance now given to this task. In the next 2 years, the $34 million spent on psychological warfare in 1950 was to be quadrupled. In the contest for men's minds, truth can be peculiarly the American weapon, Secretary of State Edward Barrett announced. It cannot be an isolated weapon because the propaganda of truth is powerful only when linked with concrete actions and policies. A highly skillful and substantial campaign of truth is as indispensable as an air force. 36. The truth, like the century, was to belong to America. If deceit needed to be used to promote the truth, then so be it. It was what Koestler called fighting against a total lie in the name of a half-truth. The purpose of the IOD, said Braden, was to unite intellectuals against what was being offered in the Soviet Union. The idea that the world would succumb to a kind of fascist or Stalinist concept of art and literature and music was a horrifying prospect. We wanted to unite all the people who were artists, who were writers, who were musicians, and all the people who follow those people, to demonstrate that the West and the United States was devoted to freedom of expression and to intellectual achievement, without any rigid barriers as to what you must write and what you must say and what you must do and what you must paint, which was what was going on in the Soviet Union. I think we did it damn well. 37. The IOD operated according to the same principles that guided Wisner's management of the non-communist left. The purpose of supporting leftist groups was not to destroy or even dominate, but rather to maintain a discreet proximity to and monitor the thinking of such groups, to provide them with a mouthpiece so they could blow off steam, and, in extremis, to exercise a final veto on their publicity and possibly their actions if they ever got too radical. Braden issued clear instructions to his newly established IOD posts in Europe. Limit the money to amounts private organizations can credibly spend, disguise the extent of American interest, protect the integrity of the organization by not requiring it to support every aspect of official American policy. 38. Braden's new division had been created to provide a better institutional base for entities like the Congress for Cultural Freedom, and it was to him that its managers were now answerable. The real objectives of the Congress were clarified. It was not to be a center for agitation, but a beachhead in Western Europe from which the advance of communist ideas could be halted. It was to engage in a widespread and cohesive campaign of peer pressure to persuade intellectuals to dissociate themselves from communist fronts or fellow traveling organizations. It was to encourage the intelligentsia to develop theories and arguments which were directed not at a mass audience, but at that small elite of pressure groups and statesmen who in turn determined government policy. It was not an intelligence-gathering source, and agents in other CIA divisions were warned not to attempt to use it as such. It was to provide independent support for American foreign policy objectives, which sought to promote a united Europe. Through membership of NATO and the European movement, the latter being substantially endowed by the CIA, which included a reunified Germany. It was to act as an emissary for the achievements of American culture and work to undermine the negative stereotypes prevalent in Europe, especially France, about America's perceived cultural barrenness. And it was to respond to negative criticism of other aspects of American democracy, including its civil rights record. The people who had been chosen by the steering committee to animate the newly consolidated Congress were all subject to security checks, as were those who came to be closely involved with the controlling apparat and all future employees of the Congress. For the CIA, there were Michael Josselson and Lawrence de Neufville. Their needs were serviced by a specially assigned case officer who, in the course of a 3-year watch, would liaise with a counterpart of equal rank in Washington, who in turn was accountable to an IOD branch chief. The chief of Branch 3 looked after the Congress. He answered to the IOD Deputy Division Chief and the Division Chief, Braden. As the Congress grew, various additional agency personnel were assigned to look after its finances and activities. Far from being what Koestler had initially envisaged as a small, shoestring operation like Willy Munzenberg's, with little money, only scant personnel, and no common form behind us, 39, the Congress had now become an asset of one of the fastest-growing divisions in the CIA, 40. True to form, Braden decided to run Operation Q Copra out of lines, and to this end he instructed de Neufville not to tell Wisner's man running the French desk, Robert Thayer, anything about his activities. Above Braden's head, Allen Dulles privately told de Neufville he was to keep up with Irving Brown and find out what he was doing, though de Neufville would soon report back to Dulles that this was almost impossible because he was running it like it was his own operation, and he never said much about what he was doing. 41. Not surprisingly, Dulles, Wisner, and Braden never acquired reputations as good managers. Josselson and de Neufville were quick to establish the Paris office and sort out the housework, agency speak for the domestic arrangements common to all front activities. Whilst they dealt with the fixtures and fittings, Nabokov arrived to take up his new post as General Secretary, moving from New York with Patricia Blake to a little apartment in Rue d'Assas, overlooking the Luxembourg Gardens. There were no modern precedents, no models in the Western world. He wrote of the organization he now represented. No one before had tried to mobilize intellectuals and artists on a worldwide scale in order to fight an ideological war against oppressors of the mind, or to defend what one called by the hackneyed term our cultural heritage. This kind of ideological war had so far been the appanage of Stalinists and Nazis. To lead a rational, ice-cold, determinedly intellectual war against Stalinism without falling into the easy Manichaean trap of phony righteousness seemed essential to me, especially at a time when in America that ideological war was getting histrionically hysterical and crusaderishly paranoiac. 42. With an energy and enthusiasm which rarely deserted him, Nabokov threw himself into his new career as impresario of the cultural Cold War. In May, the Congress presented a prize intellectual defector at a press conference in Paris. He was the young cultural attaché at the Polish embassy, a poet and translator of the wasteland, Czesław Miłosz. Miłosz had been a member of the Polish delegation to the Waldorf Astoria Conference in 1949, and there, after his first exposure to the Democratic left, he just fell in love with us, according to Mary McCarthy. Brilliantly stage-managed by Nabokov, Miłosz's appearance on the side of the Angels was an early coup for the Congress. Soon after, Nabokov, accompanied by Denis de Rougemont, went to Brussels to address a dinner sponsored by the magazine Synthesis. Then, he rushed back to promote the work of the Amis de la Liberté, a kind of Rotary Club arm of the Congress, which organized meetings of French student groups across the country and at the Maison de Jeunesse des Amis de la Liberté in Paris. In mid-June, Nabokov was on the road again, this time bound for Berlin, where he was to lecture on art under the totalitarian system. "This is, of course, no lecture trip for me," he wrote to James Burnham, "but my first prise de contact with the German field of operation." 43. This was the first of many such scouting expeditions undertaken by the Congress's executives, from which mushroomed affiliates not just in Europe. There were offices in West Germany, Great Britain, Sweden, Denmark, Iceland, but across other continents, in Japan, India, Argentina, Chile, Australia, Lebanon, Mexico, Peru, Uruguay, Colombia, Brazil, and Pakistan. Back in Paris, Nabokov played a major part in launching the Congress's first magazine, Preuve, Proof or Evidence. The idea of creating a cultural political magazine in the tradition of the great French reviews was first discussed in February 1951 at the Executive Committee meeting in Versailles. What was needed was a journal which could compete with Les Temps Modernes and encourage defections from Sartre's stronghold. Who was the real antagonist, one historian later asked? It wasn't the Soviet Union or Moscow. What they were really obsessed with was Sartre and de Beauvoir. That was the other side. 44. The left bank intellectuals were the target, a Congress insider confirmed. Or, perhaps, the people who listened to them were the target. 45. But finding an editor who enjoyed enough stature to lure these compagnons de route into a more centrist arrondissement proved to be difficult. By June 1951, Nabokov was becoming desperate, writing to tell Burnham that the question of the French magazine gives me sleepless nights. It is so hard to find someone of the stature of Aron or Camus who would be willing to undertake the editorship. The difficulty here is that although people talk a lot about commitment, nobody wants to commit himself. There is a kind of lassitude and apathy, or rather tiredness in the air, which one has to struggle against daily. Having failed to attract a French editor, the executive committee decided to give the job to François Bondy, a Swiss writer of German mother tongue, who had been a Communist Party activist until the Hitler-Stalin Pact of 1939. A key appointment to the Congress Secretariat in 1950, as Director of Publications, Bondy had collaborated on Der Monat with Melvin Lasky, who called him the editorial advisor of our time par excellence. Under Bondy, the first issue of Proves was finally launched in October 1951. Aimed at establishing an Atlanticist, anti-neutralist, and pro-American consensus, Proves was unmistakably the house organ of the Congress, giving it a voice as well as advertising its activities and programs. As such, it immediately faced what Maine Sperber called une hostilité presque totale, but Bondy stood firm in the face of virulent attacks both from the left and the right. 47. The Congress in these early days was received with almost universal suspicion. Activists who supported it convinced themselves that these suspicions were simply excrescences of the anti-Americanism so in vogue at the time. Those who were unable to do so simply sublimated their concerns. Detractors, however, took every opportunity to question the Congress's legitimacy as a free and independent organization. That it was able to survive these challenges is a mark of the dogged persistence of those, on the inside and on the outside, who believed in its purpose. When George Altman, editor of France Tireur, and François Bondy were dispatched to Rome in late 1950 to engineer support for an Italian affiliate, they were repeatedly asked, "Who's paying for all this? And by freedom, do you mean American capitalism?" Communist observers seemed to be present, they said, at most of their meetings, and many Italian intellectuals were clearly susceptible to the totalitarian temptation. Others, like Alberto Moravia, were reported to be more concerned about neo-fascism than communism. In their report to Josselson, Bondy and Altman stressed the provincialism and anti-Americanism of Italian intellectuals. There were great possibilities for the Congress in Italy, but these would only mature as the result of slow, indirect, diversified, and extremely discreet action. 48. The Italian Association for Cultural Freedom was formed in late 1951 under Ignazio Salone and became the center of a federation of about 100 independent cultural groups to which the association provided speakers, books, pamphlets, films, and an internationalist ethos. It produced the bulletin Libertà della Cultura and later Tempo Presente, edited by Salone and Nicola Chiaramonte. But no sooner was the Italian affiliate assembled than it started to fall apart. Nabokov was dispatched to Rome to try and nudge the Congress's interests along, but like Bondy and Altman before him, he found the intellectuals apathetic and too ready to listen to curious rumors about the Congress. Complaining to Irving Brown about the Silonesque lethargy of our Italian outfit, Nabokov said that radical measures were needed to get blood into the Italian apparatus. Silone thrones invisible in heaven and prevents the kids in the office from doing their work. I wrote him 2 letters. I wired to ask him to descend from his summer vacation for a day to see me here in Rome. No answer to anything. I see dozens of people daily. Most of them are ready to join, work, help, including Moravia, but all say that so long as Silone is the sole master here, no work will be done. Nabokov whined. 49. Alarmed by its quixotic, bellicose, and arrogant attitude to the church, Nabokov also wrote to Jacques Maritain and urged him to write a long letter to the Vatican authorities explaining that the Congress for Cultural Freedom and the Italian Association had different policies. 50 Nabokov also traveled to London to rally support for the British affiliate, the British Society for Cultural Freedom, which had been founded in January 1951 at the Authors Society in Whitehall Court. Meeting with T.S. Eliot, Isaiah Berlin, Lord David Cecil, the heads of the British Council, the third program of the BBC, and Richard Crossman, who was now the Secretary General of the Labour Party, Nabokov was able to report back to Paris that the Congress had powerful allies in England. Separately, he told Burnham that many British intellectuals Think of our Congress as some kind of semi-clandestine American organization controlled by you. I think our constant efforts should be directed towards proving to European intellectuals that the Congress for Cultural Freedom is not an American Secret Service agency. 51. Using language normally favored by witting collaborators of the intelligence services, Nabokov asked Burnham to communicate to our friends in America the fundamental paradox of the situation here. We may have little time left, but we must work as if we had all the time in the world. The process of transforming the Operation Congress into a broad and a solid front opposed to totalitarianism is going to take a lot of time and, I am afraid, a lot of money. 52.